When she was 8, her father took her inside the furnace house after the fire had been banked and pressed her palm flat against the iron wall. The metal was warm, not hot enough to burn, but warm the way a living thing is warm, hours after the flame was gone. He said, "Iron does not choose sides. You have to choose for it." 26 years later, standing in a frozen rail yard with 3 children and no roof, she pressed her bare hand against a rusted iron cylinder and felt the same lesson waiting in the metal. The cabin had been Owen Pritchard's promise. 4 walls of green pine, a plank floor he laid himself, and a stove hauled up from Gunnison on a borrowed mule. He told Katrin it would hold. He told her Colorado was not Pennsylvania, that the silver would come, that the children would have a school within 2 years. Owen died in August of 1883 when a hoist chain snapped at the garnet shaft and dropped a timber cradle across his chest. The company foreman wrote "misadventure" in the log. The company paid nothing. Owen had been day labor, not a shareholder. His name did not appear on the claim deed in a way that mattered to anyone holding a ledger. Katrin Pritchard was 34 years old. She had 3 children. Reese was 11, old enough to carry water and split kindling, still young enough that his hands shook when voices rose. Anwen was 7, sharp-eyed and thin, prone to a cough that worsened in cold air. Wynne was 3. He did not understand what had happened to his father. He understood that his mother no longer sang while she worked. By late November, Ruby Camp had thinned to half its summer count. Men left owing money to the boarding house, to the store, to each other. Claims that had sparkled in June produced nothing but gray rock by October. The narrow-gauge railroad brought supplies in, but it also carried men out, and the men who left did not send money back. Katrin tried laundry first. She washed shirts for miners at 10 cents apiece and earned enough to buy flour. Then the miners left. She tried mending canvas and harness leather. The freighters who needed mending had already gone south. She cooked for Minnie Oakes's boarding house for 2 weeks, but Minnie could not afford to keep her when the boarders stopped paying. $28 and 2 bits. That was what remained when Katrin counted the coins on her kitchen table the first week of December. 40 pounds of flour in a sack that smelled of mouse. 9 pounds of beans. A half sack of oats. 1 cracked lamp chimney. 1 dull handsaw. 1 iron pot with a loose handle, and less than a cord of firewood stacked against the cabin's south wall. Wood that Owen had split in July when winter was something that happened to other people. She knew the math. A cord of wood lasted perhaps 10 days in hard cold if she kept the stove fed through the night. Less than a cord meant less than 10 days. Winter in the Gunnison country lasted from November to April. She was short by months, not weeks. The knock came on a Tuesday. Not a neighbor's knock. 2 sharp strikes followed by silence. The knock of a man who expected the door to open because he had authority over what was behind it. Ruel Fitch stood on the step with his ledger book pressed against his coat. Behind him, Deputy Hobb shifted his weight from boot to boot, ice cracking under his heels. Hobb was not a cruel man. He kept his eyes on the ridgeline while Fitch spoke. Fitch was 43, lean in the jaw, precise in his language. He ran the company store, brokered claims on the side, and held the debt paper on half the camp. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. "Mrs. Pritchard," Fitch said. "The cabin sits on store lease. Owen's account shows $11.40 outstanding. Tools, lamp oil, nails, flour on credit from September. The lease requires settlement or vacancy by the terms written here." He held out a folded paper. The paper was stiff with cold. Katrin did not take it. "The children are inside," she said. "I can see that." Fitch looked past her at the stove, the small pile of belongings, the flour sack, the children sitting on the bed with their coats still on. Wynne held a cracked tin cup with both hands. Anwen watched Fitch the way a dog watches a boot. "I have until when?" Katrin said. Not a question, a measurement. "Sundown today for the cabin. I will offer one consideration. Owen's tool chest and his claim receipt against the balance. That settles the debt, and you walk clean." The claim receipt was a single sheet of paper that proved Owen Pritchard had once stood on a piece of Colorado and called it his. The tools were a hammer, a hand drill, a set of chisels, and a pry bar, things a man's hands had shaped themselves around over years of use. Fitch wanted them because the tools had value, and the claim, if silver ever came back, had more. No, Katrin said. Fitch closed the ledger. Sundown, Mrs. Pritchard. Deputy Hobb will confirm. Hobb touched his hat brim without looking at her and followed Fitch down the frozen path. Katrin stood in the doorway until the cold forced her back inside. She did not cry. She had work to do before sundown. She loaded what she could onto a canvas drag. The flour, the beans, the oats, the iron pot, Owen's tool chest locked with a brass hasp. The blankets, 4, all wool, none without holes. The lamp with its cracked chimney. She left the stove because it belonged to the cabin. She left the table because she could not carry it and mind 3 children at once. Reese helped without being told. He tied the drag ropes with knots Owen had taught him and did not ask where they were going because he could see that his mother did not know yet. Anwin asked, "Are we sleeping outside?" "Not if I can help it," Katrin said. And then, because the child deserved more than hope dressed as certainty, "We will find a way, but tonight will be cold." They made camp in the abandoned mill yard east of the main road, where the Ruby Camp Mining and Milling Company had once crushed ore before the vein thinned and the machinery was sold or left to rust. The yard was a graveyard of industrial ambition, broken sluice timbers, a collapsed stamp frame, scattered iron parts frozen into the mud. Katrin strung canvas between 2 posts and weighted the bottom edges with rocks. The lean-to blocked the worst of the wind. It blocked nothing of the cold. That night, Wynne cried without sound. His breath came in small white puffs that disappeared against the canvas. Anwin tucked herself around him like a second coat. Reese sat with his back to a post, eyes open, listening to the dark. Katrin lay between the canvas wall and her children and counted what she had, because counting was the only thing left that felt like control. $28, 4 blankets, less than a cord of wood she had no way to retrieve from the cabin yard, a handsaw, a hammer, a locked tool chest that held a dead man's claim receipt, 3 children whose breath she could feel against her neck. She could not leave. The stage south cost more than she carried. The pass road was already unreliable. 2 freighters had turned back the previous week when ice closed the upper switchbacks. She had no relatives in Colorado. Her family in Pennsylvania had stopped writing after she followed Owen west. Returning east required rail fare from Gunnison, a town 30 miles south over Mountain Road, and she did not have the fare. If she walked with 3 children in December, the youngest would not survive the first night in the open above 9,000 feet. There was no way out. There was only through. At dawn, the light came gray and flat across the yard. Katrine rose before the children woke and walked the perimeter of the mill site, looking for anything that could become a wall, a floor, a roof, broken timbers, sheet tin with nail holes, a half-collapsed powder house with stone walls too short to stand in. And then she saw it. 15 feet of riveted iron, half sunk in cinders and frozen mud. A locomotive-type boiler shell dragged here years ago for stationary power at the stamp mill and abandoned when the operation failed. The firebox end was open, the smoke box end partially crushed. The cylindrical body was intact, rusted on the surface but solid when she pressed her palm against it. The iron was cold. Cold the way metal gets cold, deeper than air, deeper than stone. She stood there with her hand on the boiler for a long time, not because she had an idea yet, because the iron reminded her of something. Katrin's father, Dafydd Howell, had worked the iron furnaces outside Scranton, not a founder or a foreman, a furnace tender, the man who watched the fire and read the color of the heat. When Katrin was 8, he took her inside the furnace house after the evening bank and pressed her palm flat against the furnace wall. The iron was warm, not hot enough to burn, but warm the way a living thing is warm, hours after the fire had been raked. "Feel that," he said. "The fire is gone. Where did the heat go?" "Into the wall," she said. "Into the iron. And where does the iron want to send it?" "Everywhere." He smiled, not because she was clever, but because she was right. Iron does not hold heat the way stone holds it, locked in, slow to move. Iron carries heat fast. It spreads warmth across its whole body like water spreads across a flat board. A fire at one end of a bar warms the other end in minutes. That is what iron does. It moves heat. But her father had shown her the other half of the lesson too. He took her outside, where the January air bit at her ears, and pressed her hand against the same furnace wall from the outside. Cold. The heat was gone, not because the iron had stopped carrying it, but because the air outside was stealing it faster than the fire inside could replace it. Iron is generous, her father said. It gives heat to anything that touches it. Give it warm air, and it warms the cold wall. Give it cold wind, and it cools the warm wall. Iron does not choose sides. You have to choose for it. Katrin stood in the Ruby Camp mill yard with her bare hand on the boiler's sunlit curve and felt the iron warmer than the air. She moved her hand to the shaded underside. Cold bit her fingers. The difference was small, a few degrees at most, but it was real, and it was the same lesson her father had pressed into her palm 26 years ago. The boiler was not a shelter, not yet. A family inside bare iron in a mountain winter would freeze faster than a family in a canvas tent, because iron would carry their body heat outward to the wind as fast as they could produce it. The boiler alone was a death trap, but the boiler inside Earth was something else. She walked around the cylinder, studying its shape the way Owen might have studied a rock face. A rectangular cabin had corners where cold air pooled and walls that the wind hit flat. Cracks opened along every joint. Heat from a stove went up and out through the roof while the floor stayed frozen. A cabin fought winter with seams and patches and endless fuel. The boiler had no corners, no flat walls for the wind to press against, no joints to crack open. The curved shell would spread warmth from a fire evenly in all directions, not just upward like a stove chimney, but around the bodies inside it. And if she packed earth over the exposed curve, the earth would do what earth does, hold warmth in and keep cold out. The iron would carry the fire's heat fast across the shell. The earth would slow its escape. The combination, fast spread, slow loss, could make a small fire do the work of a large one. She knelt beside the firebox opening and looked inside. The tube stretched away into darkness, 15 feet of riveted cylinder wide enough for a person to sit upright near the center if they ducked their head. Rust flaked from the upper seams, a smell of old ash and wet metal. But something else, too. When she leaned into the opening, the air inside was still. No wind. The curve of the iron walls had no edges to catch a draft. Whatever air entered would need to be invited in. That was the problem. A fire inside an enclosed iron tube would consume the air and replace it with smoke. Katrine's father had taught her about heat, but he had not taught her about draft. She knew the iron would spread warmth. She did not know how to make it breathe. She lit a candle stub and held it just inside the firebox mouth. The flame stood straight. She moved it deeper to the center of the tube, still straight, no air moving. She cupped her hand behind the flame and blew gently. The smoke curled upward, hit the top of the cylinder, and rolled along the upper curve toward the far end. It did not escape. It collected. She pulled her head out and coughed. The test had lasted 30 seconds, and already the smoke had nowhere to go. The shelter needed 3 things she did not yet have: a way for air to enter low, a way for smoke to leave high, and someone who understood how to make those 2 things work together inside a riveted iron tube without poisoning the people sleeping in it. Minnie Oakes found her that afternoon. Minnie was 38, broad in the shoulders, exact in her opinions, and raising 4 children of her own in the boarding house she ran with money she no longer had. She had survived 3 mountain winters by following the rules everyone agreed on: wood stacked deep, walls chinked tight, provisions stored high and dry, and neighbors close enough to shout for. Minnie looked at the boiler. She looked at Katrin. She looked at the 3 children sitting on the canvas drag, eating cold oats with their fingers. "What are you thinking?" Minnie said. Not a question, a warning. "I'm thinking that iron carries heat and earth holds it." Iron also sweats, and smoke kills faster than cold. I know. Do you? Minnie crouched beside the firebox opening and peered inside. She pulled back. That is a pipe, Katrin. A pipe with rust. You want to put children in a pipe. I want to put children somewhere they will not freeze. Minnie was quiet for a moment. Then she said what the practical skeptic always says, the thing that is true and kind and insufficient. I have floor space for one child, maybe two, if they share a pallet. But not all three, and not you. I cannot feed 6 mouths when I can barely feed 4. I will not divide them. Then what will you do? Because that thing, she pointed at the boiler, is not an answer. Children need air more than they need cleverness. Katrin did not argue. She could not, because Minnie was right about the air. She had tested it herself and coughed. My father taught me heat, she said. He did not teach me smoke. I need to learn smoke. Minnie shook her head and left a loaf of bread on the canvas drag. It was 2 days old and hard at the edges. The children ate it in pieces so small they barely needed chewing. Amos Vetter came the next morning. He was 49, heavy through the arms and chest, with burn scars across both forearms from years at the forge. He had worked as a mine blacksmith and boiler repairman for the better part of 20 years. He knew iron the way Katrin's father had known it, from the inside by touch and sound. But Amos knew iron's failures too. He had seen boiler seams split. He had seen men scalded by steam. He had seen what happened when fire and metal and pressure met without respect. He did not come out of cruelty. He came because a woman with 3 children living beside a rusted boiler in December was a problem that would eventually land on the camp's conscience, and Amos believed in solving problems before they grew. He walked the boiler first, tapped the shell with a hammer, ran his fingers along the rivet lines, knelt at the firebox end and looked inside. Then he stood, brushed rust from his knees, and turned to Katrin with the expression of a man who has confirmed what he already suspected. You are thinking about living inside this, he said. I am thinking about surviving inside it. Those are the same thought, and both are wrong. He pointed at the cylinder. That is 3/8-inch boilerplate, riveted at the courses and lapped at the crown. It will conduct heat beautifully. It will also conduct cold beautifully. When the air outside drops to 20 below, that iron will be 20 below on every surface. Your breath will freeze on the walls and drip back on your children. Unless I pack earth over it. Amos paused, not because the idea surprised him, but because it didn't. Earth will slow the loss. It will not stop it, and you have a bigger problem. Fire in an enclosed cylinder produces carbon monoxide. It is odorless. You will not smell it before it kills you. Your youngest will go first because he is smallest. He let that land. Katrin felt it. The specific weight of a man who knew exactly how her child could die. You need 6 cords of wood minimum for a proper cabin through winter, Amos said. You have less than 1. You need a tight stove, chinked walls, roof pitch to shed snow, and neighbors within shouting distance. You have none of it. You need meat or beans for 4 months. You have 9 pounds of beans and a sack of flour. He counted her deficits the way a foreman counts tools, precisely, without judgment, without hope. I cannot build a cabin, Katrin said. I cannot buy wood. I cannot leave. I cannot divide my children. Then you need to find someone who will take you in. Will you? The question hung between them. Amos lived alone in a one-room shack near the forge. He had no family in camp. He had room. He also had a reputation, and a single woman with 3 children living under his roof would end that reputation in a week. No, he said, not unkindly, simply. He turned to leave. At the edge of the yard, he stopped. Do not get clever with that boiler, Mrs. Pritchard. Clever is what kills people who do not have enough to survive on their own. Katrin watched him go. She looked at the boiler. She looked at her children. Anwen was crouching beside the firebox mouth, holding the candle stub Katrin had used for the smoke test. The girl had relit it and was watching the flame lean in the faint air current coming through the open end. Mama, Anwen said, the smoke goes up and to the left. Does that help? Ruel Fitch heard about the boiler by Thursday. News in a shrinking camp travels the way water travels downhill, fast, along the easiest path, gathering dirt as it goes. By the time the story reached Fitch's counter, Katrin was not just sleeping beside a rusted boiler. She was, according to the men who told it, planning to seal her children inside a piece of railway scrap and set it on fire. Fitch saw opportunity, not in the boiler, in the ridicule. A woman judged unfit could be separated from her property more easily than a woman judged desperate. If the camp decided Katrin Pritchard was mad, Fitch could take Owen's tools and claim receipt without a fight. He could say he was protecting the children. He spread the story carefully. He did not invent. He selected. He told it at the counter while measuring out coffee for 2 miners heading north. He told it to Deputy Hobb, who repeated it out of genuine concern. He told it to the wife of a teamster, who told 3 other women before supper. By Friday, the story had a shape. The Pritchard widow was living in the mill yard. She was dragging dirt onto a rusted cylinder. She had sealed one end with canvas. She was going to cook her children alive or suffocate them, depending on who was telling it. 2 miners stopped on the road Saturday morning. One was Orrin Pike, broad-shouldered and not unkind. The other was a younger man whose name Katrin never learned. They watched her sorting cinders into dry and wet piles while Anwin held a flour sack open. Pike tapped the boiler shell with the handle of his pick. The iron rang. A dull, thick sound, nothing like a bell, more like a drum with the skin pulled too tight. "That thing is a coffin with rivets," Pike said. He was not being cruel, he was stating what every man in camp believed. Katrin did not answer. She kept sorting. Reese carried a bucket of dry cinders from the ash pile near the collapsed stamp house and poured them into the sack without looking at the miners. The younger man laughed. Not at Katrin, at the situation. The absurdity of a woman and a boy filling a flour sack with cinders beside a rusted boiler while winter closed around them like a fist. Pike did not laugh. He looked at the children, and then he looked at the road toward Gunnison, and then he walked away. The younger man followed. Neither of them offered to help. Fitch came Monday. He did not bring the deputy this time. He came alone, which was worse, because it meant the visit was business, not law. Mrs. Pritchard. He stood at the edge of the yard, clean boots, closed ledger. "I've been thinking about your situation. I would like to offer a resolution." "I heard your resolution at the cabin." "This is a different offer. I will forgive $4 of the debt, more than a third if you sign over Owen's claim receipt and the tool chest. You keep your flour, your blankets, your children. You walk to Gunnison with enough cash to take a room for a week. After that, you write to your family in Pennsylvania." "My family did not answer the last letter." "Then you write again." "The point, Mrs. Pritchard, is that staying here is not an option that ends well for anyone. Certainly not for those 3. He looked at the children. Anwin looked back. Fitch held the girl's gaze for a moment and then looked away. "A judge will not fault me for recovering property from a woman who chooses a boiler over a roof," Fitch said. "And if someone were to suggest that children sleeping in a metal tube in December amounts to endangerment, well, the deputy would have to act." There it was, not a threat dressed as kindness, just a threat. Fitch was telling her that the ridicule was not the danger. The danger was that ridicule could become a legal weapon. Children could be taken from a mother judged unfit. Tools and claim receipts could be seized from a debtor judged irrational. Katrin's hands were full of cinders. She set the bucket down slowly. "Owen's tools are not yours," she said. "The claim receipt is not yours. The debt is $11. When I have $11, you will be paid. Until then, the children stay with me and the tools stay locked." Fitch opened the ledger. He made a mark, visible, deliberate, meant to be seen. Then he closed it and walked back to the road. Katrin's hands were shaking, not from cold. Amos Vedder appeared at the yard's edge that same afternoon, drawn by the noise of Fitch's visit or by his own restless sense that the situation was accelerating. He found Katrin on her knees beside the boiler, scraping frozen mud from the lower curve with a stick. "You are still here," Amos said. "Where else would I be?" He looked at the trench she had started digging around the boiler's base, a shallow channel meant to carry water away from the foundation. It was the right instinct. Amos recognized it, though he would not say so. "Iron sweats in freeze-thaw," he said. "Smoke kills an enclosure, and earth slides when it thaws. You are building a shelter with 3 ways to die inside it. Then tell me how to stop the smoke." "I told you, do not build the shelter." "That is not an answer. Tell me where a cracked seam leaks first, at the crown or along the lower course." The question stopped him. It was specific. It was the right question. A person who asked where smoke leaks in a boiler seam was not a person acting on desperation alone. It was a person thinking about draft, about pressure differentials, about how heated air rises and finds the weakest exit point in a riveted structure. Amos opened his mouth to answer and then closed it. He would not help her do something he believed would kill her children. But someone else spoke. "Crown first if the draw is wrong. Lower seam if the mud freezes and pulls." Tomas Baca sat on the bench of his freight wagon at the road's edge, reins loose, his 2 mules standing patient in the cold. He was 58, Hispano, born in the San Luis Valley, and he had spent 20 years hauling freight, boiler parts, and mine timber across the mountain passes of southern Colorado. Before that, he had washed boilers and worked as a fireman for a narrow-gauge railroad contractor. The man who kept the fire burning right, who read the draft by sound and smoke color, who knew what happened inside a riveted cylinder when heat and cold and pressure met. He did not climb down from the wagon. He did not offer anything. He simply answered the question because it was the right question and he knew the answer. Amos turned to him. "Do not encourage this." "I did not encourage," she asked. "The crown leaks first when draw fails. That is a fact, not encouragement." Katrin looked at Tomas. Tomas looked at the boiler. He studied the rivet lines, the rust pattern, the angle of the firebox opening, the partially crushed smokebox end. He studied it the way Amos had studied it, with professional attention. But where Amos had seen a danger, Tomas saw a problem. And problems, unlike dangers, had solutions. "You want to live in that," Tomas said. "I want my children to live through the winter." "Those might be the same thing. They might not. Depends on whether you can make it breathe." "I cannot. Not yet." Tomas was quiet for a moment. The mules shifted. A gust of wind sent a spiral of dry snow across the yard. "I will look at it," he said. "Tomorrow. I will not promise anything. I will look." It was not charity. Tomas Baca did not do charity. He had seen something in Katrin's question, in the specificity of it, in the fact that she had asked about seam location rather than whether the idea was possible. She had already decided it was possible. She needed to know how to make it safe. That was a different kind of person than the one Amos saw. Amos shook his head and left the yard. Katrin watched Tomas guide the mules back onto the road. She did not thank him. Thanks were for after. CTA. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who only saw the outside of what you were building? Tomas came the next morning, earlier than Katrin expected. He brought a cold chisel, a hand hammer, a ball of wire, and a piece of stove tin rolled and tied with cord. He did not explain what the tools were for until he had examined the boiler himself. He walked the full length of the cylinder, tapping every third rivet with the flat of the chisel. He listened. Most of the rivets rang solid, a short, clean note that meant the plate beneath was tight. Near the crown, about 8 feet from the firebox end, one rivet rang differently, a longer note with a buzz underneath like a finger on a cracked glass. "This seam sings wrong," Tomas said. "The plate has shifted or the rivet has corroded thin. Smoke will find this before you do." He marked the spot with a scratch from the chisel. Then he crawled inside, something Amos Vetter had not done. He moved slowly through the tube, feeling the walls, checking the riveted lap joints, pressing his thumb against the seams. When he emerged, his shirt was streaked with rust, and his expression was the careful neutrality of a man forming an opinion he is not yet ready to share. "The shell is sound except for that seam in the crushed smokebox end," he said. "The firebox throat is open, which gives you your flue path if you build a pipe to carry smoke out. The problem is inlet. You need air coming in low and leaving high, and the air must move even when there is no wind to push it." "How?" Tomas picked up the cold chisel and the hammer. He walked to the leeward end of the boiler, the end that would face away from the prevailing wind, and crouched beside the lower curve of the shell, about 6 inches above the cinder bed. "Here," he said. A slot cut into the plate, 2 inches high, 8 inches wide, low enough that cold air enters at floor level, where it is heaviest. The fire warms it. Warm air rises, carries the smoke to the top of the curve, and the smoke travels along the crown toward the firebox throat. You build a tin pipe from the throat to outside. The smoke leaves. The air enters. The cycle holds as long as the fire burns, and the slot stays clear. He said this while pointing, while demonstrating with his hands, while making Reese crouch beside him to watch where the chisel would cut. The lesson was not a lecture. It was a man showing a boy where to put his eyes. "What if ice blocks the slot?" Reese asked. Tomas looked at the boy. Reese had asked the second right question of the morning. "Then you clear it. Every morning. Every time the wind shifts, you check the slot the way you check a stove damper. If the flame in your candle leans toward the slot, air is moving. If the flame stands straight, something is blocked. You fix it before you sleep. You never sleep without checking." He handed Reese the candle stub. "Practice. Light it inside and watch which way the flame goes." Reese took the candle with both hands, as if it were something more than wax and string. Tomas spent the rest of that first day cutting the air inlet. The cold chisel on boiler plate was brutal work. Each strike rang through the yard like a small bell, and the iron gave up metal in tiny curls that left bright edges under the rust. Katrine held the chisel steady while Tomas struck. Her hands numbed from the vibration. By midday, they had an opening 2 inches high and not yet 8 inches wide. Her palms were raw. "Tomorrow we finish the slot and start the flue," Tomas said. He did not say he would return. He said we, which meant he had decided. That night, Katrin and the children slept in the lean-to again. The temperature dropped enough that the water in their drinking tin grew a skin of ice. Anwen coughed in her sleep, a wet, barking sound that Katrin counted in the dark, 7 times before dawn. The boiler sat 15 feet away, silent, rusted, half buried in cinders and frozen earth, waiting to become either a shelter or the coffin everyone said it was. Katrin did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the iron tick as the cold contracted the metal, and she thought about her father's hands on the furnace wall, and she thought about Tomas marking the bad rivet with a scratch, and she thought about Anwen's cough, and she thought about Fitch's ledger with its careful marks, and she thought about the slot in the iron that was not yet wide enough to let the air in. 6 days. Tomas had looked at the sky and said 6 days before the weather changed. She had 6 days to turn a rusted boiler into a place where children could breathe and sleep and live. The iron ticked, the cold pressed down. Somewhere on the ridge above camp, a tree cracked from the frost, a sound like a rifle shot that echoed once and then was gone. Katrin lay still and counted what she had. The slot took 2 more hours to finish. Tomas and Katrin worked in shifts. She held the chisel. He struck. Then he held, and she struck, because her arms needed rest and his did not yet. When the opening reached 8 inches wide and 2 inches high, Tomas swept the iron filings from the lower curve with his sleeve and crouched to look through the slot from outside. "Good," he said. "Now we see if the boiler wants to breathe." He lit a stub of candle inside the tube near the center and placed it on a flat stone. Then he walked to the firebox end, the opposite end from the slot, and held his palm near the old firebox throat opening. For 10 seconds, nothing. Katrin watched the candle flame through the slot. It stood straight. Then the flame leaned. Not much. A degree, maybe two. But it leaned toward the slot, toward the fresh air entering low, and the faintest thread of smoke curled upward from the candle's tip, traveled along the crown of the cylinder, and drifted toward the firebox throat where Thomas waited. "There," he said. His voice carried through the iron with a strange round quality, as if the boiler were speaking for him. "Air comes in low, smoke goes high. The curve is the chimney. Now we need a pipe at the throat to carry the smoke outside, or it collects at the far end and pushes back." He unrolled the stove tin he had brought. It was a piece of scrap, maybe 18 inches long, dented, with a seam that had been soldered once and opened again. Not enough for a proper flue, but enough for a test. They wired the tin into the firebox throat at an angle, pointing upward and outward. The joint was ugly, wire wrapped over iron, gaps stuffed with clay that Katrin mixed from the creek bank mud and ash. Tomas said it did not need to be beautiful. It needed to work until they could build something better. He lit a small fire, not in the center of the tube where a person would sleep, but near the firebox throat, on a flat piece of scrap iron he called the fire pan. The fuel was 3 sticks of kindling no thicker than a thumb, laid crosswise. The fire was pathetically small. A child could have stepped on it. "Watch the candle," Tomas said. The candle flame leaned harder now. The fire's heat rose, pulled fresh air through the slot, and the smoke, thin, gray, smelling of pine resin, traveled along the crown of the cylinder, reached the firebox throat, and curled out through the tin pipe. Not all of it. Some smoke pooled at the seams near the crown, especially at the spot Tomas had marked with a scratch. But most of it left. Katrin breathed. The air inside smelled of smoke, but it was breathable. Her eyes did not sting. The iron wall near the fire pan was already warm to the touch. 6 feet away, at the center of the tube, the wall was cool but not cold. The heat was traveling, spreading through the iron the way her father said it would. Generous, directionless, fast. "The seam leaks," Tomas said, pointing at the scratch mark where a thin wisp of smoke seeped through. "We pack clay over it from outside, and the flue needs to be longer, with a hood at the top so wind does not push smoke back down. But the principle holds. The boiler wants to breathe. You just have to let it." Reese stood at the slot opening, watching the candle. His eyes were wide. Not with fear, with the particular concentration of a boy who has just seen something work that everyone said would not. "The flame is leaning," Reese said. "That means air is moving," Tomas told him. "When the flame stands straight, something is wrong. You check the slot. You check the flue. You do not sleep until the flame leans." The next 4 days were the hardest labor Katrin had ever done. Harder than laundry in Pennsylvania, harder than hauling water up the hill to the cabin, harder than the night she birthed Wynne in a room so cold the midwife kept her coat on. This was different because every hour of work was also a race, and the finish line was not a task completed, but a temperature that had not yet arrived. Day 2. Tomas showed her how to pack the earth cover, not dirt shoveled loose against the iron. That would slump, freeze, crack, and slide off in the first thaw. The base layer was dry cinders from the stamp mill ash pile, raked and sorted to remove chunks of slag. Cinders drained water and did not freeze into a solid block the way wet soil did. Over the cinders, dry soil. Reese and Katrin filled buckets from the sheltered bank behind the powder house, where the ground had not yet frozen solid. Over the soil, frozen clods packed tight, which would act as a shell once they locked together. The work was buckets, dozens of buckets. Katrin carried them from the bank to the boiler, a distance of 40 yards, and Reese carried half buckets because full ones made him stagger. Anwin sorted cinders, pulling out sharp slag pieces that could cut through canvas if the earth shifted. Wynne sat on the drag wrapped in a blanket, watching, sometimes crying when the wind changed and threw grit into his face. Katrin's hands blistered on the first day. By the second day, 2 blisters had torn open and bled into the bucket handles. She wrapped her palms with strips torn from a petticoat and kept carrying. The cloth turned brown, then stiff, then useless. She replaced it and kept carrying. Tomas worked on the flue. He needed more tin, more wire, and a piece of angled iron for the hood. The camp had scrap if you knew where to look, and Tomas knew. He pulled a section of stovepipe from the collapsed assay shed. He found wire in a tangle behind the powder house. The angled iron came from a broken stamp frame bracket that he pried loose with a bar. But the hood was the problem. Wind in the ravine came from the northwest, which meant it would strike the flue mouth directly and force smoke back down into the tube. Tomas needed something to deflect the wind without blocking the smoke's exit. He fashioned a hood from a bent coal scuttle, a half-dome of sheet iron wired over the flue mouth at an angle. Ugly, functional, the kind of solution that only a man who had worked boiler flues in mountain wind would think to build. Day 3. The first earth layer was packed over the lower curve. Katrin stood back and looked at what they had built so far. The boiler was half buried, bare iron on top, cinder and earth on the bottom and sides. From a distance, it looked like a rusted pipe emerging from a dirt mound. From up close, it looked like desperation given a shape. Then the snow came. Not the dry, cold snow of deep winter, but a wet, heavy snow that melted on contact with the earth cover and turned the top layer to mud. The mud slid. 3 hours of packed soil slumped off the south curve and pooled in the drainage trench, clogging it. Katrin dug the trench clear with her hands because the shovel handle had cracked the day before. The mud froze to her wrists. Reese lost a mitten. Not dramatically, it fell from his coat pocket while he carried a bucket, and by the time he noticed, the snow had covered it. He spent 20 minutes searching, barehanded, until Katrin made him stop. She gave him her left glove. She worked the rest of the day with one bare hand and one gloved hand, switching sides when the bare hand went numb. Day 4 brought the test that almost ended everything. Tomas sealed the entrance end with canvas, planks, and clay, a temporary closure to test the shelter's air system under near-final conditions. Katrin lit the fire pan. The smoke rose, traveled the crown, and reached the flue. For 5 minutes, the system worked. Then the wind shifted. A gust from the south, unusual, wrong for the season, hit the flue hood from behind where it had no deflection. Smoke reversed. The thin gray stream that had been leaving through the pipe suddenly pushed back into the tube, curling down from the crown in a slow, spreading cloud. Anwen was inside. She had crawled in to test whether the sleeping space was warm enough to remove her coat. The smoke reached her in seconds. She coughed. Not the familiar wet cough of her cold, but a sharp, tearing cough that doubled her over. Katrin heard it from outside and dove through the entrance flap. She pulled Anwen out by the arm. The girl vomited twice into the snow. Her face was gray. Minnie Oakes saw it happen. She had been walking past the yard on her way to the creek. She stood with her hand over her mouth, watching Katrin hold Anwen's hair back while the girl retched. "This is what I told you," Minnie said. Her voice was shaking, not with anger, with fear. Katrin could not answer. She was holding her daughter. Tomas examined the flue that evening. The hood deflected northwest wind, but caught southern gusts like a sail. He needed to rebuild the hood as a full cap with openings on 3 sides and a baffle inside. That required more tin, more wire, and time he was not sure they had. 2 days, he said. I can fix the hood in 2 days, if I find enough tin. We may not have 2 days. Then we work faster. Day 5. Tomas rebuilt the flue hood, while Katrin and Reese continued packing earth over the upper curve. The work was slower now because the soil they could reach was frozen harder and had to be broken with the pick end of Owen's hammer. Each bucket took longer. Each trip felt shorter because the light was failing earlier. Fitch sent a message through Hobb. Not a legal document, a question. The deputy found Katrin at the yard and asked, with genuine discomfort, whether she wanted him to arrange a place at the poorhouse in Gunnison. Katrin asked how long the poorhouse kept children with their mothers. Hobb did not know. She told him she would stay. Amos Vetter returned. He watched from the road for a long time, arms crossed, studying the earth-covered boiler with the expression of a man watching a patient ignore a diagnosis. Then he walked into the yard and spoke not to Katrin, but to Tomas. You are helping her build a death trap. I am helping her build a shelter that breathes. Boilers do not breathe. Men breathe. Boilers explode. This boiler has no pressure, no steam, no water. It is a shell, a tube of iron with air moving through it. I have fired worse boilers on worse mountains in worse weather, and I am still standing. You are standing because you left those boilers at the end of your shift. She wants to sleep in this one, with children. Tomas did not answer immediately. He was wiring the new hood into place, his fingers dark with soot and rust. When he finished, he straightened and looked at Amos. She asked where the seam leaks first, crown or lower course. You knew the answer. You would not say it. I said it because a woman who asks the right question deserves the right answer. Amos left without replying. That evening, Minnie Oaks sent something unexpected. Her son, a boy of 10 named Leland, appeared at the yard carrying a broken stovepipe, 2 stale loaves of bread, and a jar of rendered fat. Minnie had sent no message. The boy set the items on the ground, looked at Anwin, looked at the boiler, and left. The stovepipe was exactly what Thomas needed for the final flue section. It fit the throat with only minor crimping. Katrin looked at the bread and the fat and understood what Minnie was saying without saying it. I think you are wrong, but I will not let your children starve while you prove it. Day 6. The earth cover reached the crown. The boiler was buried, a mound of cinder, soil, and frozen clod with only the 2 ends exposed. The entrance end had canvas and plank ceiling with the low air slot at the bottom. The firebox end had the flue pipe rising through a clay collar, capped with Tomas's rebuilt hood. The drainage trench was clear. The sleeping space inside was 15 feet long, wide enough for 4 people to lie along the curve if they arranged themselves head to toe. Katrin packed the cracked seam with clay from outside, pressing it into the gap with her thumb until the clay squeezed through and Tomas could see it from inside. They sealed it with a second layer of ash paste. The smoke wisp stopped. Tomas insisted on one final check. He lit the fire pan, closed the entrance, and sat inside alone for 1 hour. Katrin stood outside with her hand on the iron, feeling the warmth begin to move through the metal, slow and steady, spreading from the firebox end toward the entrance end like a pulse traveling through a body. After 1 hour, Tomas emerged. His face was calm. His hands smelled of smoke, but his eyes were clear. The candle leaned the whole time, he said. The seam held, the hood held. The air moved. Is it enough? For a mild night. For a bad night, I do not know. Nobody knows until the bad night comes. The weather held for 2 more days. Cold, but not killing cold. Katrin moved the children inside the boiler on the evening of the 6th day and spent the first night with all 4 of them arranged along the lower curve on boards laid across cinder blocks. The boards kept their bodies off the ground where cold air pooled heaviest. Blankets went under and over. The fire pan held a coal no larger than an egg and 3 sticks of kindling. The first night was not comfortable. The boiler's interior was dark, close, and loud with breath. The iron walls curved inward above them, rust-colored in the lamplight, like the inside of some enormous animal. Wind whimpered until Katrin sang, not a song, just a hum, low and steady, and the iron picked it up and carried it along the curve until the whole shelter seemed to vibrate with it. Wind slept. By morning, Katrin checked the candle, still leaning. She checked the walls, warm near the fire pan, cool near the entrance, but nowhere cold. The iron had done what her father said it would. It had carried the heat. She checked outside. The water in a tin plate she had left on the ground was frozen solid. The air bit her face when she pushed through the entrance flap. She pulled back inside and felt the difference. Not warm, not like a house with a stove roaring, but still. Calm. The absence of wind. The absence of that grinding, constant drain of cold air moving across skin. Tomas came that morning and measured. He had borrowed a thermometer from Amos's porch, taken it, actually, without asking, and returned it later with a charcoal mark at the reading. Outside at dawn, 12 degrees below zero. Inside the boiler, near the floor, 38 degrees. Inside at shoulder height, 46 degrees. The difference between outside and inside was 50 degrees, achieved with a fire so small that wind could have covered it with both hands. The fuel consumed overnight, less than a shovel pan of coal and 3 sticks no thicker than a wrist. A conventional cabin would have burned a wheelbarrow load to maintain the same temperature difference, and it would have lost most of that heat through the roof, the door gaps, and the unchinked walls. Katrin did not lecture anyone about these numbers. She did not need to. Tomas marked the thermometer with charcoal and left it on a stone outside the entrance where anyone could see it. Reese counted the sticks each morning and kept a tally scratched on a board. Anwin touched the wall at different heights and reported which spots were warmest. The data accumulated through action, not explanation. Amos saw the thermometer on his second visit. He said nothing about the numbers. He said, "A mild test proves nothing. Wait for the real cold." Minnie came the following day. She crawled inside, the first time she had entered the boiler, Isirs, and sat for 10 minutes in silence. Then she said, 38 degrees is not warm. 38 with no wind is a different world than 12 below with canvas snapping, Katrin said. Minnie touched the wall. She touched the sleeping boards. She looked at the fire pan with its tiny coal. She looked at the flue pipe disappearing into the clay collar. She did not say Katrin was right, but she did not say she was wrong either. She left and sent another loaf that evening. Fitch grew nervous. Katrin's death or departure were the events his ledger required. A woman surviving inside a boiler was not in his calculations. He told 2 men at the store counter that the boiler was company property, abandoned on store-leased ground, and that anyone helping the Pritchard woman build on it might find themselves owing rent for the use of salvage. The threat was vague enough to be deniable and specific enough to make Tomas consider whether his freight contract with the store was worth the risk. The weather shifted on the 8th day. A wet snow fell, heavy, shining, wrong for deep winter. It sat on the earth mound and on the rooftops and in the wagon ruts. Everything dripped. The sun came through the clouds in pale stripes that felt almost warm. Men came out of their cabins and stood in it, faces tilted up. Tomas did not tilt his face. He stood beside the boiler and smelled the air. There was a quality to it, a softness, a weight, that he recognized from years of mountain freight work. Warm air from the south pushing against cold air from the north. The warm air was winning now, but it would not win for long. "This is the kind that turns mean," he said. "When the cold comes back, it comes fast. Wet ground freezes to glass. Wet wood will not light. Wet canvas becomes a board." He looked at Katrin. "Tonight or tomorrow night. You should be inside before it changes." Katrin looked at the sky. She looked at the mound of earth over the boiler, wet now, glistening. She looked at her children playing in the slush, Reese throwing a ball of wet snow at Anwin, who ducked and laughed, a sound Katrin had not heard from her daughter in weeks. She let them play for 1 more hour, then she brought them inside. The cold returned after dark like a door slamming. The temperature did not drop gradually, it fell. The wet snow on the ground became a crust of ice in less than an hour. The slush in the wagon ruts froze into ridges that would break an ankle. The canvas tarps over the freight wagons went rigid and cracked when the wind hit them. Water left in buckets became solid. The air itself seemed to thicken, to gain weight, to press down on everything with a physical force that Katrin could feel through the boiler's iron walls. Inside, she had prepared. The fire pan held a small coal bed, not roaring, not even visible as flame, just a red glow in a nest of ash. 3 sticks of dry pine laid beside it, ready to feed. The candle burned near the air slot, its flame leaning steadily. The entrance flap was doubled, canvas over canvas, with a gap at the bottom where the cold air crept in low and slow, feeding the draft. The first hour passed in near silence. The children lay on the sleeping boards, blankets pulled to their chins. Wynne slept immediately. his face pressed against Katrin's side. Anwen lay with her eyes open, watching the lamplight move across the curved ceiling. Rhys sat near the entrance, candle in hand, watching the flame. "Still leaning," he said. "Good. Tell me if it changes." The second hour brought the first test. The wind shifted from northwest to due west, and it came harder than any wind Katrin had heard since arriving in Colorado. The boiler rang. Not a crash or a bang, a low, sustained hum, like a finger drawn around the rim of a bowl. The earth mound absorbed most of the force, but the exposed ends, the entrance and the flue, caught the wind directly. The entrance canvas bulged inward. The flue moaned. Wynne woke and cried, "The walls are talking." "The walls are holding," Katrin said. She pulled him close and felt his heartbeat through the blanket, rapid and small. Rhys checked the candle. Still leaning, but less. Less. The wind was disrupting the draft. If it disrupted it enough, the smoke would stop leaving and start collecting. Katrine crawled to the air slot and pressed her hand against it. She could feel cold air entering, but weaker now. Something was partially blocking the slot from outside. Ice, blown debris, a ridge of frozen slush pushed against the lower curve by the wind. She took the spoon from the pot, the long iron serving spoon with the bent handle, and pushed it through the slot. She scraped. Ice crackled. She pushed harder. A chunk of frozen slush broke free and fell away, and the cold air rushed in with a force that made the candle flame snap sideways. "Leaning again," Rhys said. The third hour brought Minnie Oakes. Katrin heard pounding on the entrance planks and opened the flap to find Minnie crouched in the dark, with her youngest daughter Lottie bundled against her chest. Minnie's face was white, not from cold, from smoke. "The stovepipe cracked," Minnie said. "Smoke filled the upper room. The boarders went downstairs, but Lottie was coughing and I could not." She stopped. She was shaking. Katrin looked at the child. Lottie was 5, thin-faced, breathing in shallow pulls. Katrin looked at the interior of the boiler. 4 people already. Air demand calculated for 4. A 5th person, even a child, meant more breath, more moisture, more carbon dioxide competing with the oxygen. She opened the flap wider. "Bring her in." Minnie crawled through the entrance with Lottie held against her chest. The boiler, which had felt close with 4, felt smaller with 6. Minnie pressed herself against the curve and held Lottie in her lap. The girl's breathing steadied as the smoke-free air reached her lungs. "I told you children need air," Minnie said. Her voice was very quiet. "The air is moving," Katrin said. "Watch the candle." Minnie watched. The flame leaned. The 4th hour brought Fitch. Not inside. Outside. His voice came through the iron, muffled but distinct, carried by the metal the way sound carries through a pipe. "Pritchard." He was shouting against the wind. "I have witnesses that you are occupying company salvage. If anyone dies in that structure, you will answer for it. Do you hear me? You will hang for it." Katrin did not answer. She was watching the entrance flap, which the wind was tearing at. One corner had pulled free from the plank frame. Cold air flooded in, not through the slot where it belonged, but through the gap, uncontrolled, chaotic, disrupting the careful balance of draft that kept the smoke moving in the right direction. She grabbed the corner of the canvas and pulled it back. The wind fought her. She braced her foot against the plank frame and held the canvas with both hands, while Rhys found a nail and the hammer. He drove the nail through the canvas into the plank, while Katrin held the fabric taut. The nail bent on the first strike. He straightened it, struck again. It held. Fitch's voice came again, fainter now, as if he were moving away. "On your head, Pritchard." The 5th hour was the worst. Meltwater from the earlier thaw had soaked into the upper earth layer, and as the temperature plummeted, the water froze and expanded. The frozen earth pressed against the iron with enough force to produce a sound, a slow, grinding creak that traveled the length of the boiler like something alive shifting in its sleep. At the same time, the drainage trench on the uphill side clogged with ice. Water that should have drained away began seeping under the cinder bed, finding its way through the lowest point in the packed earth and creeping across the floor of the shelter. Reese felt it first. His sock was wet. He pulled his foot up and touched the sleeping board. Dry. He touched the ground below the board. Wet. Mama? Water. Katrin crawled to the spot. The seep was small, a trickle, not a flood, but in a shelter where warmth was measured in degrees above freezing, water on the floor meant cold, drawing heat from every surface it touched. The cinder bed that was supposed to drain had become saturated because the trench outside was blocked. She could not go outside. The wind was dangerous, the ice was treacherous, and leaving the shelter meant opening the entrance and destroying the draft balance. But someone had to clear the trench. Reese! She held his eyes. The trench is frozen shut outside the entrance. You need to open it. Not far. 3 feet of trench, clear the ice. Let the water drain downhill. You go out, you clear it, you come back. I will tie a rope around your waist. It is dark. The ice will tell you where the trench is. It will be the low spot. Use the spoon. She tied a length of rope, the same rope that had held the canvas drag, around his waist. Reese took the iron spoon and crawled through the entrance flap into the wind. The cold hit him like a wall. Katrin held the rope and counted. She could hear him. The scrape of the spoon against ice, the crack of frozen mud breaking, a sound that might have been a word torn away by the wind. 30 seconds. She pulled the rope once. Reese pulled back twice. Still working. 45 seconds. The scraping stopped. Then it resumed, harder, faster. A chunk of ice broke free, and she heard water move. A gurgle, low and sudden, the sound of a clogged drain opening. 55 seconds. Reese came back through the entrance flap with ice in his hair and his bare hands red and shaking. Katrin pulled him onto the sleeping boards and wrapped his hands in a blanket. He was trembling so hard, his teeth clicked. The trench is open, he said. The water's going downhill. Inside the shelter, the seep slowed and stopped. The cinder bed began to drain. CTA. If you're invested in this story, stay with us, because the next choice Katrin makes decides whether that boiler becomes a shelter or the coffin everyone said it was. The 6th hour brought the flu crisis. The wind, which had been shifting between west and northwest, swung fully south, the same direction that had caused the backdraft on day 4. Smoke appeared at the crown. Not much. A wisp, then a thread, then a haze that Katrin could see in the lamplight. Anwin coughed, then Lottie coughed. Minnie looked at Katrin with an expression that held no accusation, only the raw question, what now? The coal scuttle hood deflected northwest and west wind. It did not deflect south wind because Tomas had not had time to build a full cap. The smoke was reversing in the flue, pushing back down into the shelter, and every minute it continued meant more poison in the air. Katrin remembered Tomas's words. The hood works if the wind does not change. The wind had changed. She needed to change the hood's angle, or block the southern exposure, or find some way to restore the draft before the smoke accumulated to dangerous levels. She could not go outside herself. Minnie could not leave Lottie. The only person who could go was Reese, and she had already sent him into the cold once. Reese. He looked at her. His hands were still wrapped. The flue hood needs to be turned. The wind is coming from the south. You need to climb to the flue and knock the ice off the hood and turn it to face south. Can you do that? I just came back in. I know. The boy looked at the smoke haze near the crown. He looked at Anwin, who was pressing her face into a blanket to filter her breathing. He looked at Wynne, who was asleep against Katrin's leg, trusting the air. Reese unwrapped his hands. They were raw and cracked across the knuckles. He took the rope, retied it around his waist, and crawled back through the entrance. This time Katrin counted in heartbeats. She could hear him climbing the earth mound, the crunch of frozen soil under his knees, the scrape of his boots finding purchase. The flue pipe was at the far end, 5 feet above ground level, accessible only by climbing the mound and reaching over the packed earth. In daylight, with dry ground, it was a 10-second task. In darkness, on ice, In wind that could knock a grown man sideways, it was something else. She heard metal ring, the spoon hitting the flue hood. Once, twice, ice falling. Then a scraping sound as he worked the hood around on its wire mount. The wire was stiff with cold. He would need to bend it with numb fingers. 1 minute. The smoke inside was thickening. Minnie had pulled her shawl over Lottie's face. 1 minute, 15 seconds. The draft changed. Katrin felt it before she saw it. A shift in the air pressure inside the shelter, a slight pull toward the firebox end. The candle flame, which had been wavering uncertainly, leaned hard toward the slot. The smoke haze at the crown began to move, slowly at first, then with purpose, traveling along the curve toward the flue. In 30 seconds, the air was clear. Reese came back through the entrance for the second time. He did not speak. His hands were bleeding at 2 knuckles where the wire had cut through frozen skin. Katrine wrapped them again and held him against her side. He was 11 years old. He had saved the air twice in one night. Across the camp, the night was breaking things. A miner named Orrin Pike, the same man who had called the boiler a coffin with rivets, tried to ride out the freeze in a canvas wall tent with a potbelly stove burning full. The wind dropped the stovepipe at 2 in the morning. Smoke filled the tent in seconds. 2 men dragged Pike out by his boots. He was half conscious, retching, his face black with soot. They wrapped him in a horse blanket and walked him up and down the road until he could stand. A shed roof behind the boarding house collapsed under the weight of wet snow that had frozen into a solid slab. The crash woke what was left of the camp. Men stumbled out into the cold and stood in the road, breath smoking, looking at the sky as if it owed them an explanation. Dawn came slow and gray. The wind eased, but the cold did not. The thermometer on Amos Vedder's porch read 27 degrees below zero, the coldest anyone in camp could remember. Inside the boiler, the fire had died to a few red flecks in a bed of white ash. Katrin had not added fuel for 3 hours. She had made the choice Reese had begged her not to make, to let the fire diminish rather than risk another smoke event in unstable wind. Instead, she had the children press blankets against the warmest section of the iron wall, the curve near where the fire pan sat, and closed the entrance tighter, leaving only the low slot open. The iron held the heat. Not like a stove holds it, not by burning more, but like a body holds it when wrapped in a blanket. The earth outside slowed the loss. The curved walls kept the warm air from rising away into corners that did not exist. The boiler became an oven cooling slowly, degree by degree, and the rate of cooling was slow enough that the family stayed above freezing through the darkest and coldest hours. When Katrin finally pushed through the entrance at dawn, the ice on the canvas crackled and fell in sheets. The air outside hurt her lungs. She looked at the camp, the collapsed shed, the blackened snow where Pike's stove had been dragged, the frost-white rooftops, the silence of a place that had been beaten and was still counting its losses. Then she looked back at the entrance. Anwen's face appeared in the gap, flushed with sleep, her breath making clouds that stayed inside the shelter. "Is it morning?" Anwen asked. "It is morning. It is warm in here." It was not warm. It was 34 degrees inside by Thomas's thermometer, which Katrin found half buried in the earth mound where it had fallen. 34 degrees is not a temperature anyone would call warm in a house, but 34 degrees inside, with no wind, and the iron walls still carrying the ghost of last night's fire when the air outside was 27 below, that was a difference of 61 degrees. That was the difference between life and death, and it had been held all night by a rusted boiler, 2 feet of earth, and a coal fire smaller than a child's fist. Amos Vedder found them at first light. He had been out since before dawn, checking on the camp, counting who was hurt and who was missing. He found Fitch's hired man, a young teamster named Collis, half frozen beside an overturned sled on the road above the mill yard. Collis had tried to move goods from the store to higher ground and had been caught by the flash freeze. His fingers were white, his lips were blue. He could not stand. Amos needed warmth, not a stove. A stove took an hour to heat a frozen room. He needed warmth that already existed, that was already holding, that could take a man in and keep him from dying while feeling returned to his hands and feet. He brought Collis to the only place in camp that fit that description. Katrin opened the entrance flap and helped drag the young man inside. The boiler, the coffin with rivets, took him in. The iron walls, still warm, began their work. Generous, directionless, fast. Amos Vetter crawled out of the boiler 20 minutes after he had carried Collis inside. He stood in the gray dawn light with rust on his coat sleeves and a look on his face that Katrin had not seen before. Not anger, not embarrassment, but the careful stillness of a man rearranging something he had been certain about. He did not speak to Katrin first. He walked around the mound, studying the earth cover, the drainage trench, the flue pipe with its battered coal scuttle hood. He crouched at the air slot and held his bare hand in front of it, feeling the faint pull of cold air being drawn inside. He looked at the clay seal over the cracked seam. He looked at the entrance structure, the doubled canvas, the plank frame, the nail holes where Reese had fought the wind. Then he came back to where Katrin stood and said the words that should land quietly, without theater, because honest men do not perform their corrections. I was wrong about the coffin. He paused. I was not wrong about the danger. Smoke in an enclosed space kills. Wet earth shifts. Iron sweats when temperature swings. Every one of those things is true. She beat the danger because she gave it rules. He said she, not you, even though Katrin was standing in front of him. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to the idea, to the principle of the thing, and his respect was for the method, not the woman. That was Amos. He would come around to respecting Katrin herself, but it would take longer because he was a man who trusted systems more than people. Katrin did not thank him. She asked him a question instead. The hired man, Collis, will he keep his fingers? Amos looked back at the boiler entrance. 2 on the left hand, maybe not. The rest, maybe. He is warm now. That is what matters first. Collis stayed inside the boiler for most of that day. Minnie brought broth. Katrin kept the fire pan low and steady, fed it a stick at a time. By afternoon, color had returned to the young man's face, and he could move his right hand well enough to hold a cup. His left hand stayed wrapped. He did not say much, but when Fitch's name came up, someone mentioned that Fitch had sent Collis out to move goods. The young man closed his eyes and turned toward the iron wall, and the conversation ended. The camp came to the boiler over the next 3 days. Not in a crowd, 1 at a time, 2 at a time, the way people approach something they mocked when they need it to be real. First came Orrin Pike, the man who had called it a coffin with rivets. He arrived on the second morning after the freeze with his hat in his hands and soot still in the creases of his neck from the tent fire. He did not apologize for the remark. He asked how the draft worked. Katrin showed him the slot, the flue, the candle test. Pike listened the way miners listen, with his hands touching the iron, feeling the air move, pressing his palm against the warm curve. How much fuel? He asked. Less than a bushel basket for the worst night. Pike was quiet. His tent had burned half a cord and nearly killed him. Then came a woman named Elspeth Cray, whose husband had left in October and whose 2 boys slept in a dugout behind the assay office. The dugout had flooded during the thaw-freeze cycle. Elspeth wanted to know if the method worked with stone walls instead of iron. Katrin told her iron carried heat faster, but stone held it longer. A stone dugout packed with earth outside and a proper flue inside would work on the same principle, only slower to warm and slower to cool. Elspeth asked if Katrin would come look at the dugout. Katrin went that afternoon. Then came the men Katrin had not expected. 2 miners who had repeated Fitch's story at the store counter and laughed about the widow in the pipe. They did not come together. Each came alone, at different hours, as if the act of asking required privacy. They wanted to know about the trench, about the earth packing, about how thick the cover needed to be, and whether a culvert section from the mine would serve the same purpose as a boiler shell. Katrin answered every question. She did not remind them what they had said. She did not need to. They remembered. Minnie Oakes came last. She had already been inside during the crisis. But this visit was different. This was not a woman fleeing smoke with a child in her arms. This was a woman with a notebook and a pencil, sitting cross-legged on the sleeping boards, writing down what Katrin told her. The order mattered, Katrin said. You could not skip steps or rearrange them. First, dry base. Cinders or gravel, never raw soil, because raw soil holds water and water steals heat. Second, earth cover. 2 to 3 feet minimum, packed in layers. Cinders, then dry soil, then frozen or compacted clods. The layers prevent slumping and create air pockets that slow heat transfer. Third, low inlet. Air enters at the lowest point, on the side sheltered from prevailing wind. The opening must be small enough to control airflow, but large enough to clear with a hand or spoon if ice blocks it. Fourth, high flue. Smoke exits at the highest point on the opposite end. The flue must extend above the earth mound and have a hood or cap to prevent wind reversal. The flue must be clearable from inside using a wire or rod. Fifth, small flame, never a roaring fire. A coal the size of a fist and a few sticks. The iron does the work. The fire only needs to give the iron something to carry. Sixth, never seal every gap. The shelter must breathe. A fully sealed enclosure becomes a coffin within hours. The low inlet stays open always, even in the worst wind. If the wind blocks the inlet, clear it before doing anything else. Seventh, the trench stays open. Water flows downhill. If the trench freezes, the shelter floods. Check the trench before you sleep. Check it when you wake. Check it when the weather changes. Eighth, keep the candle test. A candle near the inlet, flame leaning inward, means air is moving. Flame standing straight means the draft has failed. Fix the draft before you fix anything else. Air is more important than warmth. Minnie wrote it all down. When she finished, she looked at Katrin and said something that was both apology and acknowledgement, compressed into 5 words. My Lottie slept because of you. Katrin shook her head. Lottie slept because the air moved. It was not modesty. It was accuracy. Katrin did not build the boiler. She did not invent earth sheltering. She did not create the physics of draft. She had listened to her father, asked the right question, found a man who knew the answer, and done the work. The method belonged to the principals, not to her. She would insist on this distinction every time someone tried to make her into something she was not. The measurable comparison spread through the camp without Katrin needing to announce it. Minnie's boarding house had burned nearly half a cord during the freeze night and still filled with smoke when the stovepipe cracked. Katrin's shelter had used less than a bushel basket of coal and kindling for the same night and maintained breathable air even with 6 people inside. Pike's canvas tent had collapsed and nearly killed him. 2 shed roofs had failed under ice-loaded snow. The boiler shell, under 2 feet of packed earth, had held its shape and its warmth. The numbers were not abstract. They were visible in the woodpiles. Every household in camp could count their remaining fuel and calculate how many nights it bought. Katrin's method stretched fuel by a factor that defied what anyone in camp believed possible. In a place where wood cost money and time and labor, where every cord represented days of cutting and hauling, the difference between a bushel basket and half a cord was the difference between making it through winter and running out in February. Fitch understood the numbers too, and they frightened him. Not because Katrin's survival threatened his ledger, it did, but because her usefulness threatened his authority. Fitch's power in Ruby Camp came from holding accounts. People owed him. People needed him. A woman who could teach people to survive on almost nothing was a woman who reduced the need for Fitch's store, Fitch's credit, Fitch's generosity. Every family that burned less fuel bought less from him. Every dugout that used Katrin's principles was a household that owed him less. His first move was ownership. He told Deputy Hobb that the boiler was abandoned on company-leased ground and therefore belonged to the store's debt chain. Any structure built on company salvage was company property. Katrin, by improving the boiler, had improved Fitch's asset. He wanted rent. Amos blocked him. Not with law, Amos had no legal authority, but with the plain weight of a man who had been in the camp longer than Fitch, who was respected more than Fitch, and who had just crawled out of the boiler with a half-frozen man in his arms. "Ruel," Amos said, standing in front of the store while 3 other men listened. "That boiler sat in the mud for 4 years and you never looked at it. You did not salvage it. You did not move it. You did not inventory it. You left it to rust because it was worthless. Katrin Pritchard made it worth something. That is hers. The lease. The lease covers the cabin and the lot. The mill yard was never part of the store lease. You know that. I know that. Hobb knows that." Hobb, who was present, said nothing. He did not need to. The silence confirmed what everyone already understood. Fitch's claim was air. Fitch retreated, but did not surrender. He made a note in his ledger. He would find another angle. He always did. Tomas Baca did not attend the validation. He sat in his freight wagon at the edge of the yard, mending a harness, and watched Katrin teach. He had bandaged the cut on his scalp, the wound from slipping on the ice during the crisis night, with a strip of canvas and mutton tallow. The wound had stopped bleeding but had not healed cleanly. The skin around it was hot, swollen, darker than it should have been. He said nothing about it. There was work to do. Over the next 2 weeks, Tomas and Katrin improved the shelter together. The flue hood became a proper 3-sided cap with baffles inside, made from a section of boilerplate that Tomas cut and shaped at Amos's forge. Amos allowed the use of his forge without comment, which was its own form of conversion. They built a stone sill at the entrance to keep meltwater from creeping under the planks. They added a second emergency vent near the crown, a small hole plugged with a wool wad that could be pulled open if the main flue failed. They marked the safe smoke draw on the flue pipe with a line of white ash. If the smoke column rose above the line, the draft was too strong, and the fire was burning too fast. Below the line meant too slow, and smoke was pooling. The work was collaborative in a way that Katrin had not experienced since Owen died. Owen had been a good man, but not a patient teacher. He did things and expected others to watch. Tomas explained as he worked, not because he thought Katrin was slow, but because he believed that understanding why a thing worked was the difference between a person who could build and a person who could teach others to build. One evening, while they were fitting the new flue cap, Tomas told her about the boiler explosion at Poncha Pass. He had been 26, firing for a narrow-gauge contractor running timber downgrade. The boiler had been cold overnight, and the morning fireman, not Tomas, a new man, packed the firebox full and opened the draft wide. The iron heated fast on the fire side and stayed cold on the water side. The uneven expansion popped a seam. Steam hit the fireman in the chest and threw him 8 feet. He died before the engineer could close the valve. "The iron did not fail," Tomas said. "The man failed the iron. He wanted heat fast. The iron wanted heat slow. When you argue with iron, iron wins." "My father said the same thing differently," Katrin said. "He said iron does not choose sides. You have to choose for it." Tomas looked at her. "Your father was right, and he was a furnace man. A furnace tender. He watched the fire and read the color. Then you were raised by the right kind of man for this work." It was the closest Tomas came to sentiment. Their bond was not warmth in the usual sense. It was the professional recognition of 2 people who understood heat, iron, and the cost of getting it wrong. Tomas had lost friends to boilers. Katrin had lost a father to the furnace dust that settled in his lungs and stole his breath year by year. They shared the grief of people who respected dangerous tools and had watched others fail to. The disagreement came in late January. Katrin wanted to cut a second air slot on the opposite side of the boiler, a cross draft that would improve air circulation for the growing number of people who sometimes sheltered inside during storms. Tomas refused. 2 inlets, 2 paths for smoke. If the wind hits both slots at once, the draft becomes circular. Smoke does not leave. It spins. I can baffle one slot when the wind favors the other. And if you sleep through a wind change, if Reese is not watching, 1 inlet, 1 flue, 1 path, the system works because it is simple. The moment you make it clever, you make it dangerous. They argued for an hour, not shouting, not coldly, but with the intensity of two people who both understood the stakes. Tomas won the argument because he was right. Katrin conceded not because he had more authority, but because the physics supported his position. A single air path was predictable. A double path was not. In a shelter where children slept, predictable was the only acceptable answer. She learned something from the disagreement that would matter later: the difference between improving a method and complicating it. Every addition to the system had to pass a test. Does this make the shelter simpler or more complex? If more complex, is the complexity justified by a danger that cannot be addressed otherwise? If not, leave it alone. Tomas nodded when she said this back to him. "Now you are thinking like a fireman," he said. A good fireman does not add. A good fireman takes away everything that can go wrong. February was kinder than January. The deep cold eased, and the days lengthened enough that light lasted past 5. But Tomas was not well. The scalp wound had closed into an angry scar that pulled when he turned his head, and the deeper problem, the one he did not talk about, was in his chest. 20 years of smoke, coal dust, and mountain cold had built something in his lungs that no amount of rest could clear. He coughed in the mornings, a deep wet sound that he turned away from Katrin to hide. He kept working. He helped Elspeth Cray reinforce her dugout with boilerplate scavenged from the collapsed stamp mill. He showed Reese how to check rivet tightness by sound, a skill the boy absorbed with the intensity of someone who has discovered what he wants to do with his hands. He sat with Anwen one afternoon while she recorded temperatures in a notebook, correcting her numbers without condescension, showing her how to mark the time alongside the reading so the data told a story. In late February, Tomas made a trip to the tailings above the mill yard to recover a section of pipe scrap that could be used for a second shelter's flue. The trail was steep, iced over in the shadows, clear in the sun. He went alone because the work was light and the distance was short. He did not return by midday. Katrin found him seated against the outside of the boiler's earthwork, his back against the packed soil, his legs stretched in front of him. His face was gray. His breathing was shallow and fast, each exhale producing a faint whistle that Katrin could hear from 10 feet away. "Tomas?" I sat down. I could not get up. She crouched beside him. His hands were cold. His lips had a blue tinge that was not from the weather. She had seen this color before, on her father, in the last year, when the furnace dust finally closed enough of his lungs that climbing stairs became impossible. "How long?" she said. Tomas understood what she was asking. Not how long have you been sitting here? How long has this been true? Since before I met you. The cold makes it worse. The smoke made it worse before that. I have been breathing half-breaths for 3 years. She tried to pull him up. He was heavier than she expected. Not a large man, but a solid one, and his legs would not cooperate. She called Reese, who came running, and together they helped Tomas to the entrance. He refused to go inside. He said the air was better outside, which was true for his lungs, if not for his temperature. "Listen," Tomas said. He was looking at the boiler, at the earth mound, at the flue pipe with its white ash line. The draft was humming, a low, steady note that meant the fire inside was drawing correctly. He listened to it the way a musician listens to a tuning fork. "The trench. Before the spring thaw, widen it. Double the width on the uphill side. When the snow melts fast, water comes fast. The trench you have will not carry it. I will widen it. And the earth cover. The top layer will soften in the thaw. Pack a new layer of cinders on top before the mud season. Cinders drain. Mud does not." "I know. You know." He said it without surprise. She did know. She had learned it through doing, and the doing had made the knowledge hers. He died that night. Not in the boiler, outside, in Amos Vetter's shack, where Amos had carried him on a board because the shack had a proper bed, and Tomas deserved a proper bed. The cause was the chest, the cold, the years of smoke. The cut on his scalp had not helped. Infection had likely reached his blood. But the chest was the foundation of it. He had been dying slowly for years, and the mountain winter finished what the boiler smoke had started decades ago. Katrin did not attend the dying. Amos told her afterward that Tomas had been conscious until the last hour, and that his last practical instruction, or I say given to Amos, who wrote it on a scrap of paper, was to widen the trench before spring thaw. She stood at the earthwork where he had sat and pressed her hand against the packed soil. The iron underneath was warm. The hum of the draft carried through the earth, faint and steady, the sound of air moving correctly through a system that Tomas had built to breathe. She did not cry at the earthwork. She cried later inside the boiler after the children slept, with her face pressed against the curve of the iron wall. The metal carried the sound the way it carried everything, fast, generous, without choosing sides. The secondary crisis came in March, and it came without the drama of deep winter. No howling wind, no 20 below temperatures, no ice on the canvas. Instead, a warm spell. 3 days of sun that melted snow from the ridgeline above camp faster than the ground could absorb it. Wet snow slid. Not an avalanche, nothing so violent, but a slow, heavy collapse of compacted snow from the slope above Minnie Oakes's boarding house. The mass struck the rear wall of the building at an angle, caving in the timber framing, buckling the roof joists, and crushing the storeroom where Minnie kept flour, bedding, and 2 cots for overflow boarders. 2 men were in the storeroom. Halleck, a miner who had been sleeping there since losing his tent in the January freeze, and a boy named Jesper, 15, Halleck's nephew, who had arrived from Gunnison 2 weeks earlier looking for work that did not exist. The collapse trapped them under timber and wet snow. Minnie heard it from the kitchen, a sound she later described as the building sighing, as if it had been holding its breath and finally let go. She ran to the storeroom door and could not open it. Snow and timber pressed against it from the other side. She could hear Halleck shouting. She could not hear Jesper. By the time men gathered, the shouts had stopped. Amos was 2 miles away, checking a claim site. Tomas was dead. Fitch stood at the edge of the crowd and said he would lend horses if someone paid for the harness wear. Katrin arrived and did something that surprised the men standing idle. She did not start digging. She walked to the far side of the collapsed section, put her ear against the timber, and listened. "Halleck," she called, "can you breathe?" A voice, muffled and weak. "Not well. Snow on my chest. The boy is not moving." Air first. Tomas's voice in her head, as clear as the day he had set it at the firebox throat. Air comes in low. Smoke goes high. Before you build, before you dig, make sure they can breathe. She told 2 men to cut a breathing hole through the collapsed wall, not the main rescue passage, not the timber removal, just a hole wide enough for a broomstick. They balked. They wanted to pull the timber away, dig the snow out, get the men free. Katrin told them that moving timber before they knew how the weight was distributed could collapse more of the structure onto the trapped men. Air first, then assessment, then removal. The breathing hole took 10 minutes. A hand drill through the planking, then a pick handle to widen it. Cold air rushed through the gap, and from inside they heard Halleck gasp, a sound that meant he had been breathing recycled air and his lungs had just tasted oxygen. "The boy," Katrin called through the hole. "Is he near you?" "Under the cot. The cot took the weight. He's breathing. I can hear it." Katrin organized the dig. She applied principles she had learned from Tomas without ever being taught them explicitly for this purpose. They were drainage principles, airflow principles, the logic of weight and pressure that governed how Earth behaved around an iron tube. Snow on a collapsed building behaved like Earth on a boiler. It pressed from above, found gaps, followed water, and settled into the lowest point. If you dug from above, you risked caving more weight onto the trapped space. If you dug from the side, you could create a channel and let the snow drain laterally, reducing pressure gradually. She directed men to dig a side trench along the collapsed wall, angling downward so the wet snow could slide out rather than pile higher. She used 2 sections of heated boilerplate, carried from the yard by Reese and another boy, as warming shields, placed against the exposed timber near the trapped men to melt the snow ice bond and loosen the debris. The heat was not dramatic. It was patient, steady, applied where it would do the most work. The same way Katrin applied heat inside the boiler, not to overwhelm, but to persuade. Halleck came out first. He was bruised, shaking, and his left arm hung at an angle that meant something inside was broken, but he was breathing. Two men walked him to the boiler shelter, where Katrin had already sent Anwin to build the fire pan. Jesper was harder. The cot had saved his life. Its iron frame had caught the falling joist and held it 6 inches above his body. But wet snow had packed around the frame and frozen into a shell. He was conscious, shivering violently, unable to move. Katrin crawled into the space herself because she was smaller than any of the men, and she cleared the snow from around the boy's chest and face with her bare hands. The snow was dense and heavy and cold enough to burn. She got him out. Reese and the 2 miners pulled him through the trench on a board, wrapped him in blankets, and carried him to the boiler. Inside, the iron walls did their work. Jesper's shivering slowed. Color returned to his face. The fire pan burned low and steady. The candle leaned. CTA. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is often built before the crisis arrives. Fitch watched the rescue from the road. He had not helped. He had not lent horses. He had stood with his ledger under his arm and his collar turned up against the wind, watching a woman he had tried to break organize the camp more effectively than any man in it. That evening, when the trapped men were warm and Minnie's boarding house was being shored with timber, Fitch approached Katrin at the boiler entrance. He did not bring the ledger. "You could charge for this," he said. "For the teaching, for the use of the shelter. People would pay." Katrin looked at him. She understood what he was doing. He could not own the boiler through law, so he was trying to own it through commerce, to make Katrin think of the method as a product, something with a price, something that could be ledgered and controlled. "No," she said, "you are giving away value. I am giving away survival. If you cannot see the difference, that is your ledger's problem, not mine." Fitch left. He would try one more time before the story ended, but his power was thinning. Every family that used Katrin's method was a family that needed Fitch less. Every person who learned the 8 rules was a person who could face winter without credit, without debt, without the store. Fitch was watching his leverage dissolve, and there was nothing in his ledger that could stop it. By late March, Katrin Pritchard had become something she had never intended to be. Not a leader, she would have rejected the word. Not an inventor. The principles were older than she was. She had become the person people came to before they built, before they placed a stove, before they dug a cellar, before they decided where water would run when the snow melted. They came to her because she understood the question that Tomas had taught her to ask: where does the heat want to go, and where does the water want to go, and are you helping them or fighting them? Reese had become known in camp for a specific skill. He checked vents before storms. When the sky changed color, when the wind carried the smell of coming snow, Reese walked the camp and inspected every flue, every hood, every air slot he could find. He carried the candle stub and a length of wire. He was 11 years old and the most trusted ventilation inspector in Ruby Camp. Anwin kept her notebook. Temperatures, fuel loads, wind direction, cough nights. She had discovered that coughing increased when the earth cover was wet and decreased when it was dry, which confirmed what Katrin already knew. Wet earth conducted cold faster than dry earth. But Anwin had the numbers to prove it, and numbers, as Thomas had said, were what made a lesson into a rule. The boiler shelter held. It had survived the worst night of the winter, sheltered 6 people and then a 7th, withstood wind reversal and water intrusion and political attack. Its iron walls carried the memory of every fire that had burned inside them, and its earth cover, renewed with fresh cinders as Tomas had instructed, kept that memory from escaping into the mountain air. But the hostile skeptic's arc was not finished. Fitch had been diminished, not defeated, and the question of Katrin's debt, $11.40 on the store ledger attached to a dead man's name, remained open. The claim receipt sat in Owen's locked tool chest. The tools sat beside the boiler, and Fitch still held the paper. The story had answered whether Katrin could survive. It had not yet answered whether she could be free. Spring came to the Gunnison country the way it always did, not as relief, but as a different kind of problem. Snow that had been solid for 4 months turned to water. Water that had nowhere to go found its way into everything. Cellars flooded, roads became trenches. The creek below camp swelled until the footbridge planks floated loose and had to be fished out by boys with ropes. Katrine had widened the trench. She and Reese spent 3 days in early March, before the secondary crisis, before the boarding house collapse, doubling the uphill drainage channel to the width Tomas had specified in his last instruction. They lined it with flat stones from the creek bed, angled the stones so water would sheet across them rather than pool, and extended the runoff downhill past the tailings ditch. The work was cold and muddy and thankless, the kind of labor no one notices until the absence of flooding makes it visible by its absence. The boiler shelter drained. The earth cover softened on the surface but held its shape because the cinder base layer shed water the way Katrin had been taught. Other structures in camp did not fare as well. The dugout behind the assay office, the one Katrin had helped Elspeth Cray reinforce, held because Elspeth had followed the drainage rules. A second dugout, built by a miner who had listened to Katrin's instructions and then decided the trench was unnecessary, flooded to ankle depth and had to be abandoned. The miner came to Katrin and asked why his dugout failed. She told him. He said he thought the trench was optional because his site was on higher ground. She told him water does not care about high ground. Water cares about where the ground lets it go. If you do not build a path, the water builds its own, and it will choose the path through your floor. He dug a trench that afternoon. By April, 3 families in the shrinking camp used some version of Katrin's principles. Not all of them had boiler shells. Iron cylinders were not common, but they had dugouts reinforced with scrap plate, stone walls packed with earth, ventilation systems modeled on the slot and flue design that Thomas had built. Each one was different. None was perfect. All of them worked better than the cabins and tents they replaced because all of them followed the same logic. Let the earth hold the heat. Let the air move through a single path and never fight water. The teaching had become Katrin's daily work, replacing the laundry and mending that had failed to sustain her in the fall. She did not charge. She could not afford not to charge, and yet she did not, because charging would have changed what the knowledge was. A woman who sold survival instructions was a merchant. A woman who shared them was a neighbor. In Ruby Camp, where Fitch's ledger had turned every human transaction into a debt, Katrin's refusal to monetize was itself a form of power. People trusted her because she did not profit from them. Fitch could not compete with Free, but he tried. Fitch's final confrontation did not arrive as a legal maneuver or a store counter threat. It arrived as water. In late April, the spring thaw hit the camp in earnest. 3 days of warm rain, followed by 2 days of snowmelt from the upper slopes, sent a volume of water through the camp that exceeded anything the drainage could handle. The creek overflowed its banks. The road became a stream. Water ran through every low point in the settlement. Fitch's store sat on what had been a good location, central, visible close to the road. It also sat above a cellar that Fitch had dug deeper than any other in camp, because a deep cellar kept goods cool in summer and unfrozen in winter. The cellar had no drainage trench. Fitch had been told by Katrin directly during the week after the January freeze when the whole camp was asking about water management that every below-grade space needed a drainage path. He had ignored the advice because it came from a woman who lived in a pipe, and because digging a trench around his store would have required moving inventory and closing for a day. The water found his cellar the way water finds everything, by going downhill. It entered through the foundation stones, rose through the packed earth floor, and filled the space to a depth of 14 inches in less than 6 hours. 50-pound flour sacks absorbed the water and burst. Kerosene tins floated loose and knocked against each other with a hollow musical sound that Fitch could hear from the store floor above. Sugar dissolved, salt caked. Bolts of canvas wicked the water upward until the bottom 3 feet of every stored roll was dark with moisture. Fitch discovered the damage at dawn and shouted for help. He stood in the road and demanded that men carry his goods to higher ground. He held their accounts. He held their debts. He expected compliance. No one moved, not because they hated Fitch, not because they wanted him to fail, but because the goods were already ruined, and the labor of carrying wet flour and soaked canvas up a muddy slope would not save them. The men looked at Fitch, and they looked at each other, and they looked at the water still running through the road, and they waited. Fitch turned to Katrin. She was standing at the edge of the yard, Reese beside her, watching the water the way Thomas had taught her to watch it, reading the flow, noting where it accelerated and where it pooled, seeing the drainage pattern that the camp had never been built to handle. "Tell them where to dig," Fitch said. His voice was different, not commanding, not threatening, stripped of everything except the need. Katrin looked at the cellar, at the water line on the foundation stones, at the slope above and the creek below. She saw the path the water wanted to take, not through the cellar, but around it, downhill to the creek, if a trench existed to guide it. The trench would need to be 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep, starting above the store and angling southwest. She told them where to dig. 6 men dug. Fitch dug with them, his ledger left inside on the counter, his boots in water to the ankle. Within 2 hours, the trench was open and the water was draining. The cellar would take days to dry. Much of the inventory was lost, but the store would not fill further, and the foundation would hold. Fitch stood in the road afterward, mud on his sleeves, water still running past his boots. The men dispersed. Katrin remained. "The debt," she said. Fitch looked at her. He was not a man who broke publicly. He was a man who adjusted, who recalculated, who found the column in the ledger that preserved his position. But the ledger was inside, and the water was outside, and the distance between the two had become the distance between his authority and the reality of a camp that no longer needed his permission to survive. $11.40, Katrin said, against Owen's tools and claim receipt. You offered to forgive $4 in December if I signed over both. I'm offering you a different settlement. The tools stay with me. The claim receipt returns to me. The debt is marked settled, in full for winter services rendered, written plainly, not coded, not conditional. Winter services, Fitch repeated. You have a cellar full of water because you ignored a drainage trench. Halleck and the boy are alive because I organized a rescue. Collis has 9 fingers instead of none because Amos brought him to my shelter. Half the camp is sleeping drier because they followed instructions I gave freely. You can write winter services on the ledger, or you can write the truth, which is that I paid the debt in ways your columns do not measure. But the line will read settled either way. Fitch was quiet for a long time. Katrin did not fill the silence. She had learned from Thomas that silence, like draft, did its own work if you let it. I will write it tonight, Fitch said. Debt settled, claim receipt released, tool chest released. In front of Amos and Minnie. Why? Because you change numbers when no one watches. Fitch flinched. It was the first time anyone in camp had said it to his face. He nodded once and walked back into the store. That evening, in Minnie's boarding house kitchen, with Amos standing by the stove and Minnie sitting at the table with her hands folded, Fitch opened the ledger to Owen Pritchard's page. He drew a line through the balance. He wrote, Debt settled. Winter services rendered. He signed it. Amos signed as witness. Minnie signed as witness. Katrin took the claim receipt from the tool chest and held it. A single sheet of paper, creased and soft from handling, that proved Owen Pritchard had once owned something in Colorado. It was worth nothing in silver. The claim had never produced, but it was proof that her husband had existed in a way that mattered to the law, and no amount on Fitch's ledger could replace that. She did not frame it or display it. She put it in the tool chest with Owen's chisels and closed the lid. Asa Rowe arrived in Ruby Camp in May of 1884, not because the camp had anything to offer a wagon maker, but because a broken axle on the Gunnison Road had stranded a freighter within walking distance of the mill yard, and the freighter had heard there was a woman in camp who understood how things fit together. Asa was 39, widowed 2 years, with a daughter named Cora who was 9 and had her father's quiet way of watching before speaking. He was a craftsman, not a miner, not a speculator, not a man chasing silver. He built wagons, repaired sled runners, fitted axles, and shaped wood with a patience that came from understanding that a joint cut wrong would fail in the mountains and kill someone. Katrin met him at the broken axle. She had been asked to come not because she knew wagons, but because the freighter trusted her judgment about materials, which wood was sound, which was rotten, which could bear weight. Asa was already there, crouched beside the snapped axle, turning the broken end in his hands. "Green wood," he said, not to Katrin, but to the axle. "Cut too soon, dried uneven. The heart checked and the load found the check." Katrin crouched beside him. "Can you splice it?" "I can replace it. If there is seasoned ash within 10 miles. There is not. There is pine, fir, and whatever is left in the mill yard." Asa looked at her. "You know what is in the mill yard?" "I live in the mill yard." He did not ask what she meant. He went with her and looked at the boiler shelter, and he did not laugh, and he did not pity, and he did not tell her it was ingenious. He walked around it the way he walked around a broken axle, noting the joints, the angles, the places where force met resistance. He tapped the flue pipe and listened to the note. He tested the entrance frame by leaning on it. "The hinge point on your entrance is wrong," he said. "The plank swings against the wind load instead of with it. That is why the nail pulled loose in the storm. If you rehang it to open outward, the wind holds it shut instead of tearing it open." It was the most useful thing anyone had said about the shelter since Thomas died. They fixed the axle first. Asa found a piece of mill timber dry enough to serve and shaped it in 2 days. He did not rush. He measured twice, cut once, fitted the joint with wooden pins instead of nails because pins flexed where nails cracked. Katrin watched him work the way she had watched Thomas, not to learn wagon making, but to learn the habits of a person who respected the things they built. He returned the following week to rehang the entrance. He brought hinges, real hinges, forged iron, from his own stock. Katrine offered to pay. He said the hinges were scrap, which was not true. She let the lie stand because it was the kind of lie that good people tell when they want to help without creating obligation. Over the next month, Asa came to the mill yard often. He rebuilt the sleeping platforms with proper joints, so the boards did not shift when children rolled. He fitted a door frame inside the entrance that could be latched from within, a security that Katrin had not known she needed until she had it. He built a folding bunk for Wynne that tucked against the curve of the iron wall during the day and pulled down at night, saving floor space. Each project was small, practical, and completed without asking Katrin what she wanted. He saw what was needed and built it. Katrin noticed the pattern. She was not a woman who missed patterns. "You are here often," she said one afternoon while he planed a shelf bracket. "There's work to do. There is work everywhere. You choose to do it here." Asa set down the plane. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been seen and is deciding whether to be honest about it. "Cora likes Anwen," he said. "They read together. Anwen is teaching her to record temperatures." "That is not why you are here." "No, it is not." They did not speak about it further that day. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened through work. A hinge that did not freeze, a shelf that held weight, a latch that opened from inside. Each thing Asa built said something his words did not, and each thing Katrin accepted said something back. When he brought Cora to stay overnight in the boiler shelter during a late spring storm, Katrin understood that the man was trusting her with his child, and that was as close to a declaration as either of them needed. By summer, Asa had moved his tools to a lean-to beside the mill yard. By autumn, he and Cora were sleeping in the boiler shelter alongside Katrin's family. By the second winter, they had built a proper cabin beside the earthwork. Small, tight, with a drainage trench that Katrin designed, and a door that Asa hung on hinges that would not freeze. The boiler remained. It became the warming room, the teaching shelter, the emergency store. When storms came, the cabin emptied and the boiler filled, because the boiler was still the warmest place per stick of fuel in the camp. The second winter was easier and harder. Easier because the principles were proven. 3 dugout shelters in camp used Katrin's rules. Minnie kept a candle draft test hanging on a string beside her new stove. Amos marked safe flue clearances on scrap wood for anyone building a winter room. Reese walked the camp before storms, checking vents, a 12-year-old boy with a candle and a reputation. Harder because the camp was dying. Ruby Camp had never recovered from the silver decline, and the second winter thinned it further. Families left for Gunnison, for Crested Butte, for Denver. The store stayed open, but Fitch sold at a loss, and everyone knew it. The narrow-gauge railroad, which had brought the camp to life, now carried its population away. Katrin and Asa made the decision to move closer to Gunnison the following spring. The camp could not sustain a wagon maker and a woman whose primary skill was teaching people how to survive winters that fewer and fewer people chose to face. They took what they could carry. The boiler stayed. The years after Ruby Camp compressed the way years do when the crisis has passed and the living becomes ordinary. Asa built wagons in Gunnison and earned enough for a house, a small frame house with a proper stove and a kitchen window that faced south. Katrin took in laundry again and mended canvas and advised anyone who asked about stoves, drainage, and ventilation. She did not advertise. People found her the way they had found her in camp, by asking who knew about heat and air and water. Reese apprenticed with a blacksmith in Gunnison. He had Thomas's ear for iron, the ability to hear a rivet's health by its ring, to feel a seam's integrity by touch. By 16, he could weld a flue collar that drew cleanly in any wind. By 18, he had his own forge and a reputation for building stove systems that did not kill. Anwen kept the family's weather ledger through her school years and beyond. She recorded temperatures, fuel loads, wind patterns, and cough nights in a system of columns and annotations that grew more precise each year. A school teacher in Gunnison saw the ledger and told Anwen she had a mind for figures. Anwen said figures were only useful if they told a story, and the story she cared about was whether the air was clean. Wynne grew up remembering the boiler not as terror, but as the place where voices sounded round in the dark. He remembered the iron wall warm against his back and his mother's hum traveling the curve above him. He did not become a builder or a fireman or a blacksmith. He became a man who checked the stove damper before he slept, every night, without thinking about why. Cora and Anwen remained close through their lives, two girls who had learned to read thermometers before they learned to read novels, who understood that warmth was not a comfort, but a calculation, and that the calculation mattered most when everyone else had stopped counting. Katrin and Asa did not have a dramatic marriage. They had a functional one, built on shared work, shared children, shared respect for materials and joints, and the way things fit together. Asa never called himself Katrin's rescuer. He called himself her hinge maker, which started as a joke and became a truth. A hinge is a small thing. It lets a door move. Without it, a door is a wall. Katrin lived into the new century. She died in the small frame house in Gunnison with the proper stove and the south-facing window on a morning when the light came in warm and flat across the kitchen table. Asa had died 3 years before. The chest, the cold, the years, the ordinary accumulation of a body used hard and put away honestly. Katrin's death was not dramatic. It was the last breath of a woman who had breathed carefully her whole life, who had counted air the way other people counted money, and who had taught her children that the difference between living and dying was often nothing more than a candle flame leaning the right direction. In the kitchen drawer, wrapped in cloth, she kept the stub of a candle marked with soot from the first night the draft held steady inside the boiler. Reese found it when he cleaned the house. He knew what it was without being told. He kept it. By the winter after Katrin left Ruby Camp, at least 3 families in the failing settlement used some version of her rules: earth against wind, iron or stone to carry heat, a low breath for the fire, a high path for smoke, and a drain before the thaw. The method did not become a patent or a monument. It became something more frontier real, a set of instructions passed hand to hand, corrected by experience, remembered because children lived. Minnie Oakes carried the 8 rules in her notebook when she moved to Crested Butte, and she taught them to 2 women there who had lost stoves in a fire. Amos Vetter marked flue clearances on scrap wood until the day he left Colorado, and the marks outlasted him. Katrin lived out her later years in that frame house near Gunnison, in rooms that would have looked ordinary to anyone passing. But inside one kitchen drawer, wrapped in cloth she never replaced, she kept a candle stub darkened with soot. When her children asked why she kept a burnt candle in the good drawer, She said it told her whether the room wanted them alive. None of them laughed because all of them understood. The wet snow, the blue ice, the wind striking the old boiler hard enough to make the iron hum. 27 degrees below zero on Amos Vedder's porch thermometer, and a man named Orrin Pike tapping the shell with a pick handle, saying the words the whole camp believed, "That thing is a coffin with rivets." Inside the coffin, 4 children slept along the curved wall. A mother sat awake beside a coal no larger than her fist. A thread of smoke left through the scrap tin flue, rising into air so cold it froze before it faded. Ice outside, breath inside. The candle flame leaning toward the slot, leaning but not dying. The mountain tried to take the heat. Katrin Pritchard taught the iron how to keep it,